But I having experienced the life of an immigrant from childhood on, I went on to have, first of all, a life. I got to live. And second, we came here also because our lives were threatened, just like the people were trying to seek asylum. I had a chance to go to school, to be educated, to find a line of work that I loved, to succeed at it, to be mildly good at it, to make my way in the world, and to contribute. My father, the same month that we landed in America, opened up a small business in which he employed people. He didn't employ many people, but he employed people. That's what immigrants do. And Trump does not understand that. And he has no feeling for that.
What did your family escape in Germany?
When did we escape?
No, what did you escape? What was it like there?
Oh, well, we were severely harassed and oppressed, legally and in other ways, economically. And I was, from childhood, I was brought up to recognize that I lived in a world where Jews were an inferior people, and that we were not entitled to the same rights and respect that ordinary people. I sensed this from there. I mean, I knew no other world. That's the way the world was, and that's the way it is. And we wanted to leave Germany in 1934, which is a year after Hitler became chancellor, and applied for, after we made the application at the American Embassy, and my parents, especially my father, had brothers and a sister here, so there was a connection. And even with that, and they were Poles. My mother and father were born in Warsaw, and during the First World War, in 1917, my father, who had apprenticed as a tailor and then as a furrier, was by then a fully qualified furrier, and in the middle of the war, the Germans occupied Poland. Up to that point, Russia was part of Russia. And they saw Germany as the land of opportunity. First of all, the occupying German forces were much more indulgent, treated the Jews better than the Poles did. And so he was recruited by a high fashion house in Berlin to become a furrier, because their furriers had been drafted into the army. So in 1917, he went to Germany, but he remained a Polish citizen. I don't know that he ever tried to become a German citizen, but even if he did, even before Hitler, it was very hard for foreigners to become German citizens. They were very strong on the notion that once a German, always a German, and that had to happen, through the bloodlines of being born in Germany. That's before Hitler. It only intensified after Hitler. And so that's my way of explaining that they never became German citizens. And he did very well. He prospered. By the time Hitler came to power, he had not only one store, he had 2 stores. He was a very good craftsman. And he applied, and we waited, and we waited, and we waited. And it wasn't until 5 years later, because the United States had a very low quota number for Poles, because in the 1920s, if you know your history, the U.S. Congress passed a very restrictive immigration policy. So Trump is not fresh bread on this issue, which basically limited immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, Italians and Greeks, Jews, Poles, whatever, from the East Europeans, Hungarians, I guess, and whatnot. And they were happy with that. Of course, being Jews only intensified it, because within the State Department there was a strong leadership cabal that was strictly anti-Semitic, and they were not going to bring Jews into this country because they really despised Jews. So that's what we faced, and it wasn't until literally the last minute, in March of 1939, that we received the quota number. You would wait for a quota number to permit you to immigrate to the United States. My father, who had been deported the previous October, just before Kristallnacht, because he was a Polish Jew, with a lot of other Polish Jews, mostly men, but some women and children too. For some reason, my mother and my sister and I were spared deportation. And he went back home to his relatives in Warsaw, and he stayed there until we received the quota number. And when we got that, he was permitted to return to Berlin, because we had our immigration papers for the United States. At that time, Hitler's policy was to get them out of the country. So, I was kicked out of the public school. My sister was kicked out earlier. German Jews were kicked out even earlier still, but we had some sort of faintly veneer of protection because we were foreign Jews. That bought you a 5 minutes piece, you know. But I attended, after they threw me out in 1937, the Jewish community, very strong, set up a school system. They already had set up an alternate school system for the German Jews that had been kicked out of the public schools, as my sister had been earlier. And I went to school there. Didn't do very well there, but I went to school there. And it was an annex to the synagogue that I then began occasionally to attend, because I knew the synagogue was there, you know. I was not beaten up because I was a Jew, but I was hassled and scolded and verbally abused. But that became a never know mind, you know. It was like having to put your shoes on in the morning. You just learn to live with that.
So then you came over. Go ahead.
What was your first impression of America when you came here?
Well, I was very happy to leave Germany. I did not. I never looked back for a half a minute. But I was enormously gratified to hit my foot on American soil. I was only 9 years old, but I understood that we were in a far better place than we had left. And very quickly, I did everything I could to become an American kid. And I stopped speaking German. I spoke some terribly broken English, and was the butt of many of my friends' jokes. I had trouble with my V's and W's and something like that, and F's and V's. But I intensely worked to integrate myself into this country. And I was 9 years old when I landed in America in May, but I was 10 years old when I began school. Now, they put me in grade 2B as a 10-year-old. Wow. So the first and only time in my life when we lined up, I was the tallest kid in the class. And I wanted to tell you, I don't know that to my knowledge, I was the only refugee kid in the class, in the school. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, PS 115 in the Bronx. And there were no programs for English as a second language, no special training for teachers or anything like that I was aware of. I'm sure there wasn't any. But I was in the hands of really caring and loving teachers. They paid attention, and as I acquired language skills, they didn't wait for the semester to end, they moved me up. And they did this 2 or 3 times. So that by the time I graduated high school, I was behind, but I wasn't that far behind. And there was no propaganda, there was no, you have to do this, you have to be kind to immigrants, you have to be, these teachers of their own accord, out of their own personalities and their own behavior, just did this. And it's just enormously impressive. So, yes, I became an American kid very quickly.
So, you see in the news a lot of, just a lot of pro-America, pro-white, this, that, a lot of conflict going on between race or creed or color going on. You didn't experience any of that coming from Germany at the time? Or
I experienced anti-Semitism in this country. There was a Catholic school down the block. I lived in a neighborhood comprised of Jews, Catholics, and Irish people. It was mixed. They would chase us down the streets and call us Christ killers and whatnot. The difference, it wasn't that there wasn't anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism wasn't the state policy. There was plenty of anti-Semitism. I've confronted it often in my life. But it wasn't the matter that the state enforced it and enhanced it and encouraged it, which is what Trump is doing. That's exactly what he's doing.
And that's what I wanted to ask you also. So you hear people say, often they argue that because they know their history, they see parallels between Trump and how Hitler rose to power. And some people blow that off and say, oh, that's you can't compare those at all. What do you think about that?
I see it totally congruent. Before the election, I was invited to speak a couple of places, once for the New York Archives and once for something called the Torch Club. I don't know if you're acquainted with that. A lot of state and government workers and professionals belong to it. And that's exactly the point I was making. That he reminded me of fascism, of Mussolini and of Hitler, both in his posture, the way he strode and held up his hand, but also in what he said. I am the leader and the only person available to cure all your ills. There's this minority here that's undermining the country and causing all our problems. And he was also exciting a population that in part was ripe for that, which is also similar to Hitler. Hitler was speaking to people who were looking for a different solution. Hitler attacked the press in the same exact words that Trump attacks the press. Fake news, lying news. Hitler knew that he had to neutralize the media for him to attain power. His was a minority party. Trump knows that too. Maybe he finally read a book. Maybe it was about how Hitler got the power.
Probably on tape.
Maybe on tape. Maybe at video,
Well, they have the same percentage of followers, about 30%.
That's right. That's right. And he also Hitler got the support of wealthy people who saw him as a fool, but as somebody that they could control. Well, they couldn't control them. But he made them wealthy or wealthier, or he guaranteed their wealth. Well, that's what Trump is doing. Yes, I think the parallel is exact. That doesn't mean that Trump is Hitler. I don't think he's that smart, first of all. Number two, I don't think he's that structured. And three, he doesn't have an ideology per se, as he has his own whims.
So you're calling him a dumb Hitler?
I wouldn't use that phrase, but that's your phrase.
Hey, that's right.
I wouldn't want to use that. I think it lets him off too easily. I think he's very shrewd and opportunistic, and a very great danger to this country. And even if he is not Hitler himself, he may be the forerunner to Hitler, or Hitler type. He has now established a low barrier to the presidency and a low barrier to what may be said in political life to victimize and demonize populations. That it gives license to other people to. He's not alone. Bannon and other people like that, and the neo-Nazis and whatnot that have been flourishing, they're delighted with him. There's a reason they're delighted with him. He's their man.
Can you talk about how you entered into journalism and how that came about?
Well, my father, I told you, was a furrier, and he had his own business. And his idea of the future was that I would go into his business and carry on a retail fur business when all that was evaporating, right? All society was changing, but my father wasn't attuned to that. My mother, on the other hand, wanted me to be a dentist. In junior high school, it was during World War II, our junior high school class decided we would print, I think it was a weekly paper, which was mimeographed and distributed to the entire junior high school, to the joy of our class, not so much to the joy of the rest of the junior high school. And on that paper, I became the foreign editor. And so I would read basically the Daily News and the Daily Mirror and listen to the radio and scratch out a weekly column. And that was my first exposure to journalism. And I kind of liked it. But when I went to high school, which was a technical high school, I saw in one of those things, autograph books that you had in those days, and that I aspired to be a civil engineer. I had forgotten I aspired to be a civil engineer, and that I so much as written it down. But by the time I was in high school, I was pretty firmly, so that when I graduated high school, in the little caption under with your picture in the book, it says journalism. So I knew I wanted to do that. And while I was in high school, we were required to take a paper. By this they meant not the Daily News or the Daily Mirror, which are tabloids, or even the New York Post, which was then a more respectable tabloid. And they meant, basically they meant the New York Times. But I have a faintly obstinate nature, so I took the Herald Tribune instead. And I fell in love with the Herald Tribune. I really did. Reading it daily, because it was delivered to our desk in our homeroom every day, every weekday. And so I graduated high school in January, and I was not beginning college until September. So I looked for a job. And I wanted a job at a newspaper, of course. And I knew where the Herald Tribune was. And the reason I knew where it was across the street at that time from a bus depot, where you took the bus to New Jersey, where in Union City there were burlesque shows. And somehow I had stumbled in my teenage years into burlesque shows. So I knew where the Herald Tribune. See, that just shows you that every experience teaches you something. I found out where the Herald Tribune was. So I walked into the Herald Tribune, and I said, I'm looking for a job as a copy boy, because I knew that's how you begin in journalism. You run copy. And they said, we are out of copy boy jobs. And I don't know whether they said, we do have a job available as a shipping clerk in our syndicate department. And I think I said yes. And to make a long, weary story short, I got the job as a shipping clerk in the syndicate shipping department, which meant that I would run errands all over the paper, through every department of the paper. I got to know how that paper worked better than I have ever found out how any other paper worked, including papers that I edited, where I was the chief editor. Every department. I worked in the composing room, chopping mats. And how to integrate myself with the printer types and learn how to kid them along so they would print up the things you were looking for. And if they didn't like you, they could really foul you up. And I worked in the fashion department with the women, which were all women, and gathering the pictures, and Eugenia Shepard's copy and whatnot. And the sports department, of course, and the financial department, and the circulation department. We had errands all over the place. So over the years, I got to know that, because they didn't know and I didn't tell them that I was going to go in college in September. But I did, and then they rehired me every summer to come back to this glorious shipping clerk job. And again, I tell you, I loved it. I watched the columnists, Alsop and Lippman, coming over the teletype machine, word by word, sentence by sentence. And the reason I was hanging over that was that as a shipping clerk, I had to rip that copy off, give it to a typist who cut a stencil, who then I took up to the shipping room, put it on an old-fashioned mimeograph machine, inked it up, spun it off, collated the 3 pages, put them into envelopes, sealed the envelopes, and then ran them down to the Journal Post Office. That was part of my job. So I read them word by word, line by line. What better way to get instruction on how writing should be written? While I was a clerk. And toward the end of that, then it just built. And when I finished college, one of my fellow clerks had risen to the rank of editorial assistant, but he was drafted for a career. I had a college deferment, so I finished my college, and when I finished my college, I was going to be drafted. But the Tribune hired me before I was drafted, and I was an editorial clerk replacing the guy who went before me, and that was my first editorial job in journalism. And I learned the operations of the news service, which I was part of, which was part of the syndicate. But it was on the same floor as the reporters and editors of the paper. The syndicate itself was 7 floors higher, but the news service was on the 5th floor, and that's where I was working as an editorial assistant. So I integrated there, and then I got drafted, and I went to the Army, and I went to Korea. I incidentally got married along the way because I was forced to. Somebody forced my hand.
I don't know if everybody knows what the syndicate is.
Oh, the syndicate is the operation in which the work of the columnists, the cartoonists, the crossword puzzle, the fashion, any special article that could be sold to another paper is sold. In order, well, you know what, even them papers were trying to, it was a big operation, and they sold a lot of material, not only in the country, but in Canada, Mexico, around the world. And it was fun. I put me in touch with cartoonists. We had to stack the we had to go to composing room and get the zinc plates back, which we stored. They didn't store that. We syndicated books. Dwight Eisenhower's Crusade in Europe, syndicated by the Herald Tribune through the syndicate. Many others. There was a man who worked for the Pittsburgh paper who posed as a black man and then wrote about his experiences for basically the white press. And it was, in its day, a groundbreaker, right? Because he could pass for as black. He was a dark-complected white man. And it was a stunning series at the time. Herald Tribune put that out. There were many things like that. I don't remember them all. Do you remember any that I'm forgetting?
No, it's just that the syndicate was a business in and of itself within the paper.
Yes, and you remind me of another important point to make. Why I began, because of my early beginnings in journalism, before I ever became a member of a newspaper staff, an actual member of newspaper staff, I was a staff. I ran the Herald Tribune News Service. In my gradual way, when I came out of the Army, they had me typing those stencils I told you about. And after that, I became an editor on the desk, which was called a wire filer. We did everything but write headlines. You know, we edited the copy. But we did more things because we were disseminating stories written in New York and Washington for a national audience or an international audience. So there were aspects of it that were interesting and aspects that were not. So you learned how to pick the good stuff out from the bad stuff. Or not the bad stuff, but irrelevant stuff. But more importantly, you look for the story that was offbeat, that the AP and the UP and United and the International News Service didn't have. So I worked closely with the Washington Bureau and with the UN Bureau, and I with my questions, encouraged them to do those kinds of articles, which were on the news, explaining the news. And any investigative story, any story that revealed something that was of some import, was especially valuable, right? And that inculcated in me what I would, my own standards, that when I can, this is what I want. This is what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for the who struck John story. I'm looking for somebody that tells me why he struck John. And so it had a tremendous influence on me journalistically. And for all those poor souls who wound up working for me over the years.
Can I ask along those lines, how do you see the role as of editor with a reporter? You know, some see the role of editors play a coach or barking out orders or glorified copy editor. What do you see as a...
I think all of the above. I mean, I think when I ran a local news operation that had inexperienced or barely experienced reporters on it, or newly experienced, was in at the Washington Post as a Metro editor. That was the first time I had a large staff. And up to then, I had worked with foreign correspondents and things, and national correspondents. And I quickly learned that reporters are not cut out of the same cloth. They have strong points and they have not such strong points. And you try to frame the assignment as much as you can. You can only do so much. And their work frame in such a way that is most congenial to bringing out whatever their strengths are. So you got to identify their strengths, and you have to identify their weaknesses, because you have to know what you got to do. Now you can do this, but it's not a formula, and it's not perfect, and it doesn't work every time, and you can't do it all the time. You're dealing with too many balls in the air. But that was my governing philosophy, to get the most out of people and to help them get the most out of themselves. And there are many, many different ways to do that. It breaks down situations. Yeah, you're a copy editor, but you shouldn't have to be. But when you're looking it over, you're obviously doing something, right? If you see words misspelled, you hook them. But you're supposed to encourage reporters to do the work. You should make clear what the mission is. You should say, what is it that we're looking for? Ideally, what is it that we want to do? How do you do it? You can't do it all the time, but you can do it some of the time. Do it as often as you can. Who does it better than who? I have found, for example, that investigative reporters have in a sense, all reporters should be investigators, right? It should be a tautology. Every reporter should be investigator. But some people are better at it than others. And some really have a conviction. And some of the ones who are best at hunting the story, the facts, are the worst at writing them up. So then it becomes a matter of how do you get them to translate what they found into the prose that you want to put into the paper. But every reporter is a challenge and an opportunity, and I'm sure I have many people who work for me who hate my guts. I'm sure I have some who don't hate my guts. But all the time I thought and hoped and tried to behave equitably. I made a point of not playing favorites. Even when I had favorites, you know.
Mm-hmm. Is there something you think what's the best lesson, I guess, for a reporter that you've learned, maybe, or that you've passed along?
Well, I can give you the whole Ten Commandments. Be curious, be hardworking, be serious about your work, be fair-minded. Don't only pick up the evidence that supports your thesis. If you find stuff, you should be looking stuff that contradicts it, and you deal with it. Does this undermine it, or does it alter what you're saying? Energetic, curious, hardworking, and fair-minded. Know that you're in a very serious line of work, more serious today than ever, and that you want to produce work of quality, of accuracy, and there are ways to do that. It doesn't mean you won't make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Own up to them, correct them, don't do it again. Learn from them. Mistakes are much better than successes. Successes don't teach you a thing, because the odds are the success, luck played a lot of role in the success. Whatever talent and skills went into it, luck also played a role. The failures, luck didn't play a role. So look at the failures, analyze them, see what you did wrong, learn from it. Know that you're in a very serious line of work, but a very important line of work. You're the vanguard of the nation's liberties, literally, as you see it today. You're called the enemy of the people? No. You are the stalwarts of the people. You are the people that will come, that stand between him and tyranny. And you got to stand that way. And how do you stand that way? Here in in Hudson, New York? By doing your work as well as you can. By increasing the public's trust in the media, in the newspapers. By the quality of your work. And the punctiliousness of your work.
What do you think about some of the challenges reporters face now versus back then? There's, Twitter, there's all sorts of stuff.
And it's an entirely different world. I think it's much tougher on you than it was on me. And it's much tougher on my successor editors than it was on me. And the pressures and the threats from the internet, say there was no Trump, are enormous because they spew so much information, and so much of it is crap, and some of it is not crap. Some of it is very, very good. And how do you distinguish between the two? And if it's hard for us to do that, how is it not even harder for the lay people who don't have our experience dealing with news and not being able to sort the good from the bad? So it's much, much tougher today. And it has intensified the tribalism of our society. When I was your age, readers were demanding objective newspapers, and they would criticize us for not being objective. If you use that word today, you're laughed at. They want something that represents their point of view. That's something that validates their point of view, which they have acquired from the internet or some blog or something else, and they swear to it. They swear to it. It's true. It's nonsense, but it's true. Sandy Hook is a hoax. It's nonsense, but it's true. Has consequences. You're dealing in a world challenged by the internet itself, which robs us of our livelihood because it's stealing our readers and our advertising. It commoditizes us as human beings because it sells us to advertisers. And it corrupts us with native ads, with things that appear to be written by journalists for a readership, but are written by promotional people for the promotion of a product or an idea. It's much harder for you. You have to be much more alert. You have to be much brighter. You have to be much more energetic. I hope it doesn't discourage you, but that's what's on your plate. And that's why, frankly, I came here. Why would I come to Hudson? To belabor you with my I'm almost 90 years old, for heaven's sakes. And I was back then. I come just to say this, that what you're doing, and encourage you, what you're doing is so important. And I want you to keep doing it. I want you to bring other people like you to do more of it and keep doing it better and better. I think something has got to happen with the internet because everybody can hack it. Even governments are not protected against the false news produced by the internet. No, if governments can't protect themselves, how could a newspaper published on the internet protect itself? It can't. So if you're going to be an internet publication, there will be the time, if there hasn't been already, that it will be hacked, and a Russia or China or whoever will use it, and they'll say, "Oh my God, we made a terrible mistake." Zuckerberg doesn't make a mistake because he's made billions. He knew what he was doing. But somebody's got to throw a net over him, right? So, that's what I came to say. I hope I delivered the message.
A quick question for you about Watergate. So I read that Woodward had no experience in the newspaper when you hired him. Why did you hire him? Just curious.
He did not have no experience when I hired him. I didn't hire him until he had experience. When he came to me, he had no experience, but I interviewed him because he was recommended by the man who was running the Washington Post. You think I was not going to interview him? You're mistaken. And I was impressed by him because, why was I impressed? This is the 60s, 70s.
60, late 60s.
No, 70s there. So, yeah, well, at 69 I became Metro. 70 I became Metro with her. 70s. Please, correct me when I'm wrong, not when I'm right. He impressed me. Why was he impressed? He had just finished 5 years as a naval officer. Very rarely saw somebody with 5 years as a commissioned officer. He was a graduate of Yale, which didn't impress me because every third guy at the Washington Post was out of Yale or Harvard or Princeton. And he impressed me. He was serious. He was a sober citizen. He wore a necktie. And because he was recommended by, he had been mentioned by, I think the decent thing to do was something I had never done. I said, all right, I'll give you a 2-week tryout because you have no experience. And I said to Andrew Barnes, my deputy, I said, all right, you watch this guy. And he worked for 2 weeks, and I said to Barnes, well, he said, this guy doesn't know one end from the other. He barely knows how to put paper into the typewriter. He's a good saw. He's a meme saw. He's very hardworking, but nothing there. Couldn't use any of his stories. So I talked to Bradley's chief of staff, and we arranged an interview with the Montgomery County Sentinel, a weekly published in Montgomery County, which was a wealthy county just northeast of Washington. And he landed a job there, and he began to write. And we had a staff in Montgomery County. It was a very important county for us. And he began to beat our people. He revealed things. He did exposés and whatnot. He and another reporter. He caught our attention. He caught our attention of our staffers and ourselves. And 1 year, and I told him, and that called me in a year, but I said it politely, to ease him out of my office. I wanted to get on with other things. I'll see you in call me in a year, first thing, right? And he did. He called me soon in the year, and he was nagging me. My wife reminded me during one of these sessions when I blew up. I said, "Don't call me when I'm trying to paint my house." Anyway, we hired him 1 year after he left, so he had newspaper experience.
What was it like working with Bradley?
Very, very challenging. Very charismatic man. Very demanding. Very, very good working for him. He played a tough game of ball, and you learn to play. And if you learn to play in that sandbox, you learn to play.
How in these films that have been made about the Post and All the President's Men, when you watch them, what do you think of them? Are they well representative of what it was like, or? Well, they're movies, right? Yeah. They're good films. They're both very good films, and they more or less tell the story. In All the President's, the film All the President's Men, I think that the film captured very well the way the reporters worked, how hard they worked, how relentlessly they worked, and how difficult it was for them to put things together. I thought the editors were represented in in an offhanded way. We did not make flip decisions.
Our decisions were agonized. They were after dispute and argument, and almost sometimes very vicious disputes. It was, but it worked. The Post was accurate in the issues that it lay out very clearly. The Post was vulnerable in printing the Pentagon Papers because the Times had been joined by the federal court. Said, don't do this. And our lawyers and financial advisors told Catherine not to do it because there was a court order out already. And she would, while the court order wasn't directed at us, it could be argued we should have understood from that court order that it applied to us. And the financial people said, you're going public on the stock market, and your television and radio stations are vulnerable. All of that was true. And all her agonizing was true, especially as I know, about making that decision. But she told me, they had this fierce argument in Bradley's house. She was off at a soiree, I think that's in the picture, that night. And they were arguing, the lawyers and the financiers and whatnot. And Bradley and Bagdickian and Chalmers Roberts and the national staffers. I was not there. I was Metro. We're arguing they will do that. We must do this. We must do this. The Times has been shut down. We must continue this. We can't relent. And Patterson, the managing editor, finally calls Catherine at the party and said, "You have to make a decision." And she said she decided, and she told me years later when she was writing her book, she told me it was Ben's conviction that we had to do this that convinced her that she had to do this, although she risked everything. When my connection to the Pentagon Papers, which came a year before Watergate, was that the local desk of which I was in charge covered the local court, the local district court, federal court. So our reporter was covering our hearing when we began to publish the papers. The Nixon administration moved against us, and it went to court. And while the hearing was going on, I went down there to watch the proceedings. And Catherine was there with her chief financial advisor, and there was a great break in the proceedings, and I walked out in the hall to get a smoke or whatnot, and she was there with Fritz Beebe, thank you. And I said to her, "Why are you doing this, Catherine?" And that, you got all this thing, you were risking everything here. The likes of me, we're not risking anything, right? We do this this is what we do for a living, but and she said, everything we have built up at the Post over these 3 years that she had been, 3 or 4 or 5 years, the publisher will come smashing down if we don't do this. People that had been hired would leave, and that's what she said. Ben was responsible that he convinced her. But she was a person of enormous courage, and showed it many times in her life that I was acquainted with or heard about it from her own mouth. When she took over after her husband died as publisher, and she had grown up with these people from the middle 30s when her father bought the paper as a young woman, a little girl, and they sort of patronized her. And even though she was a married woman and a mature woman, they patted her on the head and you know, figuratively, if not literally, and she resented the hell out of that. That's what made her get Bradley as bring her in as the top editor. And then she empowered Bradley to build the staff, gave him the budget, and backed him. That was she had to have courage to do that. Then she had to have courage to do the Pentagon Papers. And I saw her do the, when she faced the strikers, when we're getting the new technology was beginning to come in, and we're trying to get the computers to work and whatnot, this of course threatened the back shop. Jobs are going to be, they clearly saw the handwriting on the wall, but they also had very abusive practices that they would bring up out-of-work workers from Denver or wherever into our composing room to make work for them. It was just an abusive system. And she stood up to the unions. On the way out, the unions damaged the presses so they couldn't work. She stood up to that. The presses recovered. They hired non-union laborers. They put in all the systems over time. And she courageously showed the rest of the industry that she could do this. I mean, at the papers, at the Herald Tribune, at the Post, management owned the paper, but they didn't run it. They didn't operate it. They didn't operate the back shop. The union, with their rules, operated it. And crippled it. They helped to cripple the Herald Tribune. They certainly tried to cripple the Washington Post. And I think Catherine's standing up to them and winning that battle encouraged other papers to do the same. And papers are what they are today. You see that? Now it's gone full blast and managed to bit us in the butt. But should we have seen that coming? I could maybe make an argument, yes. We should have monetized it before others did it. If they could monetize it, why couldn't we? I think that brings us to a doleful conclusion.